Drug developers, investors, researchers, and corporate executives wrestle weekly to understand what is happening in commercial development of NASH medications. Join hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Stephen Harrison, star equity analyst Yasmin Rahimi, C-suite veteran Peter Traber, and forecasting and pricing guru Roger Green as they discuss the issues affecting the evolving NASH market from their own unique perspectives on this week's edition of Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
Hello, fellow NASH-interested parties. This is Roger Green, and welcome to the third episode of Surfing the NASH Tsunami. On behalf of all of us, we want to thank you. We've gotten letters, we've gotten messages, we've gotten listeners, we've gotten our podcast shared in places that we didn't know it was going to, and all that's been fantastic. So I'd like to encourage each of you to remember to tell 5 more friends this week what a spectacular podcast this is, because we are shameless in encouraging as much participation as possible. That's number 1. Now I would like to ask my fellow surfers to say hi and answer this week's question, which is, what's the most encouraging thing you've seen in your personal life in the last week? We'll go alphabetically forward this week on first names. Peter, why don't you kick us off?
Most encouraging thing in my personal life has got to be within the lines of my property, right? So in my home, because that's where my personal life is lived right now. And there are really 2 things. One, I'm seeing my children get the hang of the new experience of online learning, which is quite interesting to see it evolve. I'm not sure they're going to want to go back to classrooms. They're enjoying that. And the other important issue for me is that our relatively new dog is getting the hang of where it is appropriate to relieve herself. And so that is a very important development.
Peter, congratulations. We are all thrilled for you. Okay, Stephen, you're up next.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us again. Great to have you. Personal life, 2 things. Number 1, we're getting an 8-week-old puppy tomorrow. So, Peter, we're picking up where you left off and beginning that whole saga of potty training and everything else. It'll be fun and challenging at the same time. Number 2, like Peter, I've had to deal with children doing distance learning or online learning. For my 17-year-old 11th grader, it hasn't been a challenge. For my freshman Texas A&M son, who had to move out of his dorm back into home, leaving the freedom that he has cherished for the past 8 months, it's been a bit of an eye-opener for us having him back and trying to find a new order of life, still giving him freedom, but understanding he's living with us. And it's been an eye-opener to see him study. He's an engineering student, so he has pretty tough classes in physics and calculus and that sort of thing. And I was a little nervous going into the physics final. He got his grade back this afternoon and he did amazing. So we're all relieved that he is going to be able to continue his training in engineering. So that's my 2 for this week.
Okay, so Yasmin, both of these gentlemen took this conversation straight to the dogs. Where are you going to start?
Yeah, so mine are actually 2 different things, completely unrelated. But one is I love bread and I always wanted to make bread. And so I, over the last 2 weekends in a row, attempted to make homemade wheat bread. And so the first batch was disastrous because the entire matrix was in grams and I didn't have a scale to really measure it out properly. And then batch 2 that I intended last week and actually ended up being really good. So that's a mini triumph. So I'm still perfecting my bread. And if I succeed, I will be sending you bread in the mail. The second one is seeing my in-laws. So this weekend, my father-in-law's birthday was last Thursday. And we got together on Saturday. I live in Connecticut. So the weather was actually, we had finally a decent day. It was like 55 degrees. So we went over to their yard. And it was remarkable to see how my in-laws, how they have really adopted their life before COVID and, just stayed away from everything and really, drastically changed their behavior. And even as we were sitting, everybody brought their own coolers, their own drinks. My mother-in-law ordered for everyone something else so that nobody would be touching someone else's pizza. So she was as thoughtful and careful in the way she was passing a chip or anything. She threw the disinfectant your way. So it was pretty remarkable to see how how thoughtful and careful she was. You know, they're social butterflies normally, and so I was actually really proud of them that they did a really great job. It was definitely, and it felt like a normal weekend after many, many weeks of being really isolated as we were 6 feet away from each other and just being able to see one another and spend some time. So
that's great. So I'm going to digress for a minute. Here's a shock. When Yasmin talked about sending bread in the mail, my senior year in high school, which was longer ago than I care to admit, the college I really wanted to get into, I wound up talking about my first job in my on-campus interview. That job was baking bagels. The interviewer was fascinated. So what I did was I went back to my work and I crafted a bagel about 3 foot by 2 foot in the shape and look of the college mascot, baked it, put it in a very large packing shelf, and sent it to her. Unfortunately, it didn't arrive as soon as I would have liked, and it arrived 2 days after they shut down for a 4-week winter break. And when she came back, her office was uninhabitable for a day. Needless to say, I did not get into that university. So if you're going to bake bread, make sure we know it's coming, because it can be really ugly if we don't.
Don't you worry. I will send you the overnighted and the tracking numbers so you don't miss out.
Excellent. Excellent. I don't have dogs and I live in a condo, but my animal story of the weekend was that this was the weekend on the canal where we live that the geese had their babies out for the first time. And it's a fantastic thing every year to watch the baby geese turn into little swimmers in formation, to turn into awkward teenagers, to kind of fly away. And we see this rhythm every year about this time, and it's one of the most reassuring annual rituals in my life. This was that weekend, so it was fantastic. Another fantastic thing is we got some wonderful queries this week, 4 that I want to comment on. In one case, we're going to actually ask a question, and in the other 3 cases, we're going to be doing something different. First of all, to the woman who wrote about a sibling and issues the sibling was having, I want to make this clear. We cannot dispense medical advice on the show, despite the fact that we have 2 MDs. We concur with you that your sibling needs to see a hepatologist for evaluation. A couple of the facts that you provided suggested potential for liver disease, but short of saying, you need to go see a doctor, we really can't cover that any further. Also, just a note to everybody who writes to us, please make sure to leave your email address, because I would not have made this an on-air comment. I would have written back a note, except that I did not have an email address or a Twitter to send something back to in private. Number 2, Niall asked a question apropos of Stephen's comment early on last week about MASH and MAFLD, and asked if we would make that the focus of a future episode. We are currently planning to do that not next week, but maybe the week after that or 2 weeks. And we will give everybody a heads-up week notice. And yes, we will try to get somebody who was on the consensus paper to take that side of the argument when we bring the conversation onto the podcast. Number 3, we had planned to have a special segment right now, which I think Yasmin even mentioned in her weekly note for Roth, about a Journal of Hepatology pre-press article about the relationship between COVID-19 and NAFLD. But I've decided that next week, which is my forecasting session, I really would like to make that article the focus of my part of the conversation. I believe I will also have a guest with me, which will be the first time we bring a guest on in this podcast, and this will be cool. I'm very, very excited about it. Finally, Kyle, a biotech researcher from a global CRO, asked a question that we're going to attempt to answer. And the question was, do you know of a particular process to tell the difference or distinguish between NASH and NAFLD? Okay, which one of the MDs wants to take this one?
Hey, Roger, I'll take it. So this is Stephen. That's a great question. It's one people often get confused about if they're reading papers and they're trying to sort out, is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease different from NASH? What's NASH? Here's the easy, spell it out in crayon way to analyze this. NAFLD is an umbrella term. It's all-encompassing. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease includes everything from isolated steatosis. That means all you've got on that liver biopsy is pate, foie gras. It's just fat. All the way through adding inflammation, dying cells, hepatocellular injury, scar tissue. That now you have NASH. NASH progresses through stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and all the way to stage 4. And that we call cirrhosis, decompensating liver disease, and liver cancer. So NAFLD is this umbrella term that really includes all of those things. Now I'm going to digress a moment on NASH. NASH stands for non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. And that is believed to be the injury pattern that can progress to cirrhosis and decompensation. And so that's been the target of a lot of work to try to develop a target drug or a therapeutic that can reverse, halt, or eliminate that disease. So let me tell you why we're doing that. There's about 100 million Americans with fatty liver. About 25 million of those have NASH. And so we're really focused on what we can do to minimize the progression of liver disease in those 25 million Americans. And those are rough estimates, but it's pretty close. It doesn't mean we ignore the 75 other million with fatty liver, because they're still at risk of developing diabetes and other comorbidities that are linked to fatty liver. I want to take it one step further. Patients always ask me, how does NASH lead to scarring? Well, that's pretty simple too. If you think of it like the skin, remember the liver regenerates. It's one of the only organs that can heal itself. The skin is another good example of that. So let's use the skin as this analogy. So when you cut the skin, you form a scab. That scab allows skin cells to grow across the wound and heal. And that once the skin is healed, the scab falls off, or you pick it off because it begins to itch. But let's suppose that you cut yourself in the same spot every day for 20 years. The scab gets bigger and bigger and bigger and never goes away. Well, that's exactly what happens to people with NASH. The injury of fat coming into the liver leads to inflammation. This inflammation drives the development of cells that normally are very quiet. They don't do anything. They're called stellate cells. Basically, they come alive, they wake up, and they begin to lay down the scab. That scab allows new hepatocytes or liver cells to grow. And once they're grown, the liver reabsorbs the scab. It can't fall off like the skin can, but it has to be reabsorbed. So if you don't get the fat out of the liver and it continues to irritate the liver, then you're going to continue to lay down the scab. And so it starts with minimal scab. We call that stage 1 disease or stage 1 fibrosis or scar tissue. And then it progresses to stage 2, which is a little bit more, stage 3, which is more, and stage 4. So if your doctor tells you you have stage 2 NASH, that means you're halfway to cirrhosis and halfway to no fibrosis. And so that's fatty liver. That's NAFLD and NASH and everything in between.
Thanks, Stephen. That's great. This week, Peter is the lead presenter. And the question really is, what are the issues C-suite should be thinking about today in the context of the pandemic and COVID-19 and what it means in liver disease? Peter, floor is yours.
Thanks, Roger. And that was a brilliant answer from Stephen on NASH and NAFLD. I have been privileged to be in the C-suite, both as a CEO and a CMO for both large and small public and private academic institutions. So I've seen what CEOs and CMOs have to consider from multiple angles during a time of relative calm and times of crises. So I've reflected a little bit on my experiences and also my current experiences with companies thinking about COVID-19 to come up with 3 issues, not an exhaustive discussion of issues that are on the minds of leadership, but 3 issues that might add value to a particular company during this time of pandemic. Now, I'm going to briefly discuss these 3 issues, and then I'm going to have a question for each of our panelists. And I'm going to have a little fun with this. I'm going to mix it up. I'm going to ask a question interspersed between the 3 issues so people don't get bored with my monologue. And the first thing I want to talk about is the involvement of the company in the COVID pandemic response. What is the company doing to help the global or local or regional response to this pandemic? The way a company approaches this can be very important to elevate the visibility of the company, to make the company part of the community. And some of the ideas that I've heard discussed and seen implemented are, first of all, involving executives and scientists in their local, regional, national, and international groups or discussions on mitigation strategies. get your experts into the mix to help the community think through what's going to be the best response and mitigation strategies, the best ways to communicate. Another way to do this is to find ways to serve the local community. I've been the acting CMO for a company in Boston, Morphic Therapeutic, which has actually found ways to both manufacture, find, and distribute personal protective equipment to hospitals and clinics in the Boston area. That's a real direct way of figuring out how to serve the local community. So these things can be very important to become visible in your regions as an important company and player in the market. Another area that I think is very important is figuring out ways to collaborate with CROs, with clinical sites, and with your KOLs in finding solutions to conducting trials during and following the pandemic. And this is where I want to ask a question. I'm going to ask Stephen. Stephen, companies may be currently recruiting or considering starting a trial in NASH. What type of involvement would clinical sites like you have a major area in, or KOLs like yourself, value from companies in this process of the company working with the community?
Well, I can tell you directly, one area that we've seen a significant amount of interest, not only from my local site, but from sites throughout our network, has been this notion we're coming together on Zoom webinars and that sort of thing to talk about the challenges of maintaining patient safety, data integrity, continuing to drive enrollment where it is important to do so. And I know we'll talk about NASH in the era of COVID and why we think that's important to treat NASH. We've talked about it a little bit already, and I think there's more to come, and I'm a big advocate for that. But one of the areas where we've really noticed, I guess we hadn't thought about it, but it became apparent when it happened. We actually had a sponsor that wanted to join us on the call. We said we were having these calls just to kind of brainstorm back and forth. And they actually got on the call, and it was amazing to see the C-suite level team members, not just the CMO, but the CSO, the CEO, the CFO, all of them on the phone, working through situations that each of our sites had, but more than anything else, showing that they were fully involved, that they were all in, that they wanted to do whatever they could to help our patients and to help our sites through this challenging time. So I would say where that can be replicated, that's only going to have a positive impact on the company and the sponsor. So that would be my reply to that question.
Stephen, that's a great message for C-suite people and managers of all levels in companies to hear and to think about how to emulate. I'm having a recent experience right now with a company that I'm advising, and they happen to be transitioning from a phase 2 to a phase 3 program. And one of the challenges they have is how to keep their sites that they want to be involved in the phase 3 program involved in the program, and also how to keep them viable. One of the things that companies have to recognize is that clinical trial sites build up infrastructure, they have personnel and so forth. And with industry stopping trials or not starting them on time, they're stressed in terms of their economic viability. And I think where companies can, if they can focus on those sites and help support them through this challenging time, that's going to pay off big dividends in loyalty and your ability to recruit your trials once it starts. So that's something I would encourage leadership to think about. Yasmin or Roger, do you have anything to add to this first discussion point before I move on to the next one?
The only comment that I like to make is thank you, Peter, and thank you, Stephen, for the insight you provided. I think from an investor perspective, when companies continue to support the local communities and work together in being able to convey this message to their shareholders could be quite impactful. So not only I think it's what they're doing behind the scenes, but putting that in the press release and making the investor community aware of all the work that they're doing behind the scenes to really fight against COVID is extremely well received. Of course, it's very challenging to think that if you press release that the stock would move a substantial amount, but it definitely builds credibility, and it just signals to the market that you are doing everything in your power to be creative and continue making progress. And I think overall that's been really well received, and not waiting for the earnings update to just unveil whether there's a delay or progress has been made. So I think unexpectedly sharing that with the investor world is incredibly impactful.
So these are all fantastic answers, and I don't know that I have anything to say that's equally helpful. We do advise clients, have advised clients for years in different kinds of crisis situations. And on one level, what COVID is the all-time crisis situation. And what we like to remind clients in those moments is that crisis management is all about relationship. You never know if you have a relationship until you need one. But the things that you can do in those moments to ensure that you have a relationship are question honestly, listen openly, don't overrepresent what you can achieve, and then the classic, right, which is underpromise and overdeliver. And if everybody brings that perspective that we're here to listen, we're here to learn, we're here to help, and we're going to do whatever they set out to do, I think it works out a lot better. And everything that you guys have talked about would fall into that category.
Thank you, Roger and Yasmin. In fact, the points that all three of you have made related to how you serve the community, but also how you allow your good acts to rise to the surface without thinking about the press release, I think is very important. And it dovetails with this next topic that I'm going to discuss. This may seem a little bit odd to you initially, but bear with me for a moment. I think that all companies should either long or for just a short period of time consider how their company's products or their development assets may be involved in the prevention or treatment of COVID-19. And I think all companies should at least give a short bit of thought to that. For some companies, it's going to be a very short thinking process, but for others, it might take more insightful discussion. And believe me when I tell you that this is a question that shareholders and other stakeholders will likely ask, because the whole world is focused on COVID-19. Because the pathophysiology and the complications of COVID touch many areas, and there will be many hypotheses about how drugs might be important in the overall process. Now, while some of the notions that you'll hear from stakeholders or stockholders and things that people might put forward will be ill-conceived, I guarantee you that. But I feel that management should have considered the questions before they get the question and have a position. I think you want to maintain that level of responsibility globally. If you have a drug that could potentially be involved in some way, you should think about it and have answers when stockholders or shareholders ask you. Now, let me just give you the next step. If you think about that, and there is a potential role, I think the company should evaluate how development might proceed. Now, of course, this is going on with all kinds of vaccine and diagnostic companies and so forth. But let me give you an example of a company that I'm on the board of, Caladrius Biosciences. One of their assets are autologous CD34 cells, and they have a potential in mitigating COVID-19 lung damage. The company recently announced, and this is why I can tell you this, public information, that the FDA authorized its IND application for the study of a CD34 cell therapy for repair of COVID-19 induced lung damage. This is a trial that obviously has not started yet, but the trial has been approved. Now, in my mind, this company, Caladrius Biosciences, did this in the right way. They analyzed their agent, they did their research, they designed a clinical trial, they submitted it to the FDA, and the FDA approved it, and then they announced it. So they went the extra mile to make sure that what they were announcing was credible, was approved by the FDA. One more point to make here, and that is while there may be NASH assets that affect inflammation and fibrosis and could be useful, it's critical that companies only put forward scientifically credible options. I can't emphasize this enough. For the credibility of your company, avoid at all costs of looking like you're trying to cash in on the COVID-19 crisis by making overly promotional statements based on suppositions or if there's no hope of clinical results in a reasonable time frame. And that's why I say, in my view, Caladrius did it the right way. There were already existing INDs for this CD34 cell therapy. There was a path forward to investigate patients with COVID-19 lung damage, and they submitted an IND and they announced it when it was accepted. But companies should consider this, but they shouldn't put out any information based on wild supposition or hypotheses, because that's only going to hurt your credibility, in my view. This, I think, is something that C-suites should talk about and be prepared to discuss when ultimately they will be asked. Let me ask Yasmin, how do you think investors, Yasmin, would view a thoughtful analysis of a company's assets for the treatment of COVID-19 if it seemed reasonable?
Thanks, Peter, for the insight. And I think it's an important question that you asked. And I think it would be very meaningful when that information is shared with the public, when it presents the data, presents the timeline, and it has gotten clearance from the FDA, or if the path is forward. So I agree with you that press releasing sort of the process that has been already in play, and especially when they are comfortable to share the preclinical data that they may have generated, the scientific rationale why it could potentially work as a treatment for COVID-19, and then followed by a timeline and a clinical trial design. So having these three pieces in alignment and in a clear fashion, not only press release, but also hosting a call to really being able to spend some time on a phone so that shareholders as well as parties that are interested could be listening rather than simplistic press release could be very important. So individuals also have the chance to ask questions. So I agree with you. I think press releasing just content that says we're evaluating early assets without a timeline, without the biology rationale, and potentially also without clinical data can make it very challenging for being received, positively received, especially as we see almost every day more than 20 to 30 press releases come out establishing that an agent has entered clinical testing for COVID-19. So it's become extremely challenging for investors to really pay attention to the different mechanisms of action. So with that, I think it's better that if you are a company working on it diligently, to wait till you have all the three pieces, the mechanistic rationale, the preclinical data that you could share, the path forward, and potentially also the green light from the FDA to go into the clinic and the clinical design, to being able to unveil all that in one setting, then it puts a lot far more confidence in the investors and thoughtfulness of the execution. So that would be my thought. One of the questions that we really fundamentally get is, and this is something in relation, is how much is the liver community, hepatologists, the ASLD, every stakeholder involved in liver therapies working on having a deeper understanding why patients with NASH are most affected. So that's a question that comes up frequently. So a question going back to you guys is, and we can talk about that in a later time point, is are we generating data sets where we show why NASH patients are at higher risk and how much work is being done collecting that data?
Yeah, Yasmin, I think they're brilliant answers and really underscore what I was getting at. And your view from the investor side, I think, is very important. And you bring up another issue, and that is, what studies can the liver community do to help our understanding of the disease in liver patients, regardless of whether the company's assets have importance or potential importance in the disease? It'd be important to learn more about NASH in the era of COVID-19. Stephen or Roger, do you have other thoughts on this?
Yeah, I do. And I'll let Stephen go last because he's generally the most eloquent, except for you, Peter. Anyway, so I'm a big fan of something called catastrophe theory. And the way catastrophe theory works is that everything goes along the same way until it doesn't. Think of getting to the edge of the waterfall, except either you go over or you don't. And that would be catastrophe theory. The question is, what happens at that moment that makes you go over or not? I think one of the fantastic things about Yaz's extremely eloquent answer is that it tied together a lot of threads of this. We know that there are issues around fatty liver and why patients with fatty liver are more susceptible to COVID. We don't know what that means for the fatty liver drugs, or really we have no answers yet, but we have this compelling question. If the liver disease community and the companies developing product medications in that space treat this responsibly and thoughtfully in the manner that the two of you are talking about, we run very little risk of looking overly opportunistic. And as it turns out that there are products that have opportunity related to COVID, those products will benefit from the good work that everybody has done to learn and to be transparent and to be open. Going back to Peter's original point, the real downside of what happens if we appear too opportunistic is that good data will be looked at skeptically. And since liver doesn't start in a particularly powerful place within the galaxy of therapies right now, we would like to look as good as possible, as scientific as possible, and be as appropriate as possible. It's in our hands. We have this fantastic opportunity, and I think the two of you, between you, did a great job of elucidating how to take full advantage of it.
Stephen, would you like to comment on this topic?
Well, I'll just speak to what Yaz mentioned from a clinical perspective as a hepatologist. We know patients with fatty liver disease don't do as well if infected with COVID-19. And there's been now more than one publication that has alluded to that. And we know that the virus can attach to both liver cells and biliary epithelial cells, ACE receptors. But really what we don't understand fully is the liver injured because of a direct result of infected liver cells, or is it injured because it's an innocent bystander in the cytokine storm and the systemic milieu that this virus has caused in the body? And I think to that end, we do need more studies. You know, the studies that have come out have been prolific, but they've really kind of been focused on epidemiologic type data rather than mechanistic type data. And so as we transition to the next phase of attacking this virus, then I think it becomes critical for us to understand pathophysiologically how this virus is interacting inside the liver, and is there something we can do to mitigate that? So to that end, I think lots of people are beginning to look at this, but from a liver company perspective, where we have bench scientists that are well-versed at handling viral infections within hepatocytes, this becomes a prime opportunity to take that to the cellular level and then into the animal model and then onward from there. So lots more to do, but I think there's a great opportunity.
That's an outstanding answer. And I think that it really says that in the face of this pandemic, we really need all brains on deck. And those people thinking about liver can have just as big an impact. And I want to end this segment just going back to the cautionary note that you have to take in talking about how you might be able to, your company might be involved in this pandemic. There already have been companies whose hands have been slapped by the SEC for over-promoting potential therapies in COVID-19, and that will continue. You want to avoid, like the plague, so to speak, being one of those companies that gets their hand slapped by the SEC. So you must be thoughtful and conservative. So the last issue I'm going to bring up is something we've touched on last couple of weeks and even in the last couple of questions, and that is evaluating your assets considering a COVID-19 world. Now, I'm one of those people who thinks that this pandemic could be a watershed moment in history. I think that behaviors and markets may have long-term shifts, which ultimately have a change in direction for different industries. Now, I know this is going to be a very broad question, but you guys are smart people. So I'm going to ask you to kind of play a futurist. And I'm going to start with the smartest one of us, Roger. I'm going to ask you to think about the future here and how might the drug consumer market for NASH shift? And how might companies consider positioning their assets going forward, thinking about that future world where the risk of COVID-19 and pandemic or potential increase in pandemic is a possibility? Roger, you want to take that on?
It's a fantastic question. Thank you, Peter, and thanks for just a great presentation of all three of these issues. I think what makes this issue so complicated is going back to what Stephen just pointed out. We don't know enough about the pathophysiology of the disease or diseases yet to understand exactly the role that different kinds of liver-targeted therapies can play in the pandemic. The answer could be anywhere from the liver is heavily implicated and a more robust liver will lead to way better outcomes for people, far better outcomes for people, to the liver is an innocent bystander and will not have that significant a role. So I think both are possible, and if this sounds like I'm ducking your question, please forgive. But I think about what I would do if I had to make that decision from a managerial perspective, and this is why people get heavily engaged in the concept of scenario planning, that you could have 4, 5, 6 radically different outcomes. Peter, I'm not smart enough to tell you which one you're going to get yet. But what I do know is that when you look managerially at the critical success factors for outcomes ranging from liver is right at the heart of it to liver is way at the periphery, you're going to identify 4, 5, 6 critical success factors, and some will be common and some will not. This is a pivotal moment to understand the common factors because those are the things that your company has to get right, and they'll vary from company to company. And in the rest of the cases, it's being extremely aggressive and extremely agnostic in scanning the environment to figure out in what direction things are going at, and then being nimble enough to respond appropriately. If I had to guess, I would guess that what we're going to learn is that liver is meaningfully implicated, and that if the companies behave responsibly and do good research and discuss these issues intelligently, that this will be a moment at which over the next few years, the liver medications and liver therapy plays a much more prominent role in terms of how we think about overall treatment. That's just my speculation. The other scenarios, careful planning, identifying commonalities, that I know everybody has to do, because if they don't, they're going to lose either money or opportunities or both.
Well, that's very good, Roger. And I can tell as a futurist, you're a glass half full type of person. I think that's a potential vision of scenario planning for the future that can be practical for people. I want to ask Yasmin, are investors open to thinking about how COVID-19 will affect the potential NASH market? I'm sure that investors always plan for the worst and hope for the best in some ways, but what are some of their concerns and vision for how COVID-19 might affect potential NASH markets, if you can put on your futurist hat a bit?
I think for right now, I think investors are sort of concerned about companies that are in the developing therapies in NASH, given that they fear that patients might be worried to be part of a clinical study because they would be at high risk of leaving their house, visiting a clinical site, and that could introduce a delay in enrollment and timelines, and especially given that phase 3 trials are large studies of 1,000 to 2,000 patients and lengthy. So every patient that gets enrolled is really incredibly important to be part in the analysis. So right now, I think they're more concerned and trying to understand how each drug developer is coming with creative solutions to maintain their timelines and maintain the integrity of their trials. That's one. However, I think fast forward 6 months from now, what I suspect could be happening is that as we're continuing to collect data from patients who are affected and we start characterizing the comorbidities that are present, I think we will have a better understanding that these patients have elevated liver enzymes, have, fatty liver disease, and we will discuss it in our next episode. But ultimately, we will learn or have an answer what percentage of the COVID patients are NASH patients. So I think that, to me, is going to be meaningful. And one that could spark is that patients and the public will become aware of NASH as a risk factor for COVID. And the biggest criticism that exists in the NASH landscape has been the lack of M&A activity. And I think that when public awareness is shifted towards NASH, especially if we identify it as one of the strongest comorbidities and putting patients at risk, and given that large pharma's commitment in developing therapies and vaccines is going to even further spark their interest to wanting to move forward therapies, not only for the sake of reducing liver-related events, but truly COVID-related mortalities that is present. So I do think that we don't have that data yet, and we will be collecting that, and I think that mentality would change. So I'm actually very optimistic that the excitement for NASH will be rejuvenated as we are headed over the next 6 months. And a lot of answers we will get also, of course, over the next second half of this year in regards to the first AdCom, the approval, reimbursement, and many other answers that will be addressed. I think COVID-19 could help the NASH market to bring awareness from the public and awareness to a asymptomatic disease and get everyone on the same page to work against not only COVID, but also against NASH.
That's a very insightful answer, Yasmin. Thank you. I think that Yasmin, gentlemen, has mentioned a phrase that might be part of a future podcast when she said M&A activity and what's going on there and what's keeping things moving or not moving. I want to end this section just by asking Stephen to comment on something. So Stephen, you and I have been clinicians and scientists for many years, some a few more than the other, but really have seen practice of medicine and development progress dramatically in liver. Also, you're a positive guy with a military foundation who looks at the future and sees positivity. What would be your message to our colleagues out there who are on the front lines and thinking about this disease and how to approach it? Do you have some words for them?
Well, sure. I thank you for that opportunity. First of all, I'd say my hat goes off to you, having served in Iraq in 2009 and to Tikrit and been blessed by taking care of America's finest. That you're in the same battle. It's just in the U.S. and you're on the front lines, whether you're in New York City, Detroit, small town USA. My little brother is an ER doc in Jackson, Mississippi, and fights the battle every day he goes to work. So I'd say thank you very much for that. My hat goes off to you, a standing ovation, and please stay safe. Beyond the front lines become the next battlefront, and that battlefront is vaccines, it's antibody testing. It's really what we talked about before, understanding the interplay of viral connection with hepatocytes if you're a liver doctor or lung cells or infectious disease or whatever you happen to be an expert in. All hands on deck, all brains on deck, as you alluded to, in trying to get at not only putting this thing to bed, but preventing it from coming back. I mean, there's speculation that this may be seasonal. And so there's a lot more to the story than just developing a vaccine, wiping our hands off and moving on to the next thing. So I would say, stay attentive, stay in tune with what's happening, and where you can help deliver some sort of answer to this virus, please do so.
Thanks, Stephen. And I'll turn it back to you, Roger.
So we've got about 8 or 9 minutes left. Peter, I had one question for you, and then I think we'll wrap up, unless someone else, and it's not just for Peter. You get to see how corporate execs and your clients and the other people you talk with are handling these issues in the industry trenches on a day-to-day basis right now. And I'm wondering what the balance is, A, between realistic optimism and crazy optimism, and B, between practical focus and aspirational focus in what you're seeing in the environment right now. How real are people keeping it, and how aggressively positive are they being, however real they're keeping it?
A good question, Roger. And I think the responsibility of a CEO or a CMO or a CSO, CFO, all those people that are leading a company, particularly when it's a public company, their responsibility is to the owners of that company and the shareholders. And they need to keep that in mind at all times. They need to be focusing on delivering the programs, impressing the street, serving their patients and their other constituencies, and doing what the mission of their organization is. At the same time, on the flip side, they can't turn their entire company over to a cause that is going to greatly diminish that effort. However, you can make the pandemic an integral part of your activities and your business because it is so important to all those other things. It's easy to take disparate kind of approaches in a company. One is the let's stick our head in the ground where we understand this science and development and just work in that area. The other is to lift your head to the heavens and forget all about the day-to-day activities. And you have to find that happy medium. It's very clear to me that that's a leadership issue. That approach is driven from the top down into the company. There are plenty of people in the company that can add to that and be critically important. But the leadership has to think about that balance and do some scenario testing internally, as you mentioned, Roger. Think about the different scenarios of effort and so forth, and constantly shift to find the right balance of serving the company's mission and the shareholders, along with serving the global community as we approach this pandemic. It's those leadership teams that find that balance that I think are going to be most successful. And I have seen companies struggle with that balance, but as long as you continue to struggle and scenario plan, you're going to end up finding the right approach.
Peter, just a personal comment. At the end of the first episode, I said, boy, this might be pretty good. At the end of the second episode, I said, boy, that was better. How do we top that? Peter, that was fantastic. And Yasmin and Stephen, thank you for some wonderful answers. I actually think we've topped that, which scares the dickens out of me when I have to take the lead next week. But, you know, a healthy fear is a great motivator, so there we go. Last round of questions for everybody, okay? What's the one thing that you heard from one of your colleagues, or even coming out of your own mouth, during the last hour that surprised you, that you wouldn't have expected to learn or hear tonight? Peter, since this was your session, I'm going to let you go first.
I think that this has been an outstanding discussion, and I have learned a lot from all three of you. I appreciated your very insightful and thoughtful answers. The one surprising thing I learned a bit is Yasmin's comment where, you know, she's been involved with investors a lot, and she thought that there would be a positive view of companies trying to do the right thing in their communities related to this pandemic. And I think that's a very positive message, that everything you do does not have to accrue to the bottom line with investors, particularly if you're doing good for your community and the world related to this pandemic. And hearing Yasmin say that was, I think, encouraging and a bit surprising.
Okay, Yasmin. Peter pointed the finger at you. You get to go next.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks, Stephen and Roger, for all your comments. If I had to say what really stood out, I think Peter's point of view, as he, works closely with many of the management teams and provides great advice, is the fact that companies really need to be thoughtful as they're thinking to position their assets in NASH. So I think it becomes really critical that for drug developers who are listening to this, really take that to heart. And what was, Peter, your phrase, not to cash in for COVID just for the sake of publicity, but rather have strong data. So I think having individuals like Peter to really urge companies to be thoughtful in their R&D plans, especially if they think that their asset has potential for a treatment for COVID-19. So that to me was really thoughtful, that to educate them. So that was very valuable in my view.
Thank you, Yasmin. Stephen?
I think there were so many awesome comments made. It's hard to find the one that sticks out the most. But again, this has been Peter's show, and I think there were many things he said that are foot stomp worthy, if you will, and that need to be reverberated and I think mentioned a second time. And maybe the biggest one for me is folks that are studying therapeutics for NASH that have taken a pause for maybe multiple legitimate reasons, that instead of sitting back and waiting for somebody to say that it's okay to start back up, I would use this time to double down on your engagement with the sites to help them. And I can just speak from my own site at Pinnacle, reflecting on what Peter said. It would be great if these sponsors that have put their studies on hold would reach out to me and my fellow principal investigators to really let us know what they're feeling. Let us dialogue with them about what we're seeing, boots on ground, what our concerns are, what the patient's concerns are, what they relay to us, so that we can pass that information through. At this point, I like to think of it as Peter said, I'm an optimistic guy. I mean, for me, the glass is always 3/4 full, not half full. What can we do at this time to really laser focus our efforts on fatty liver such that when we're through this epidemic, that we will come out of this better for our patients? We'll have disease awareness. And as Yaz mentioned, disease awareness may become first and foremost moved to the forefront because of COVID. So again, that may be another positive that sponsors can hang their hat on and use that as a leverage point to reach out and build capital on disease awareness. You also, Yaz, mentioned about the PDUFA date and maybe our first drug coming. That's great news for patients with NASH, but it's also great news for disease awareness. So I think there's lots of things we can learn from this. And I've learned a lot from this podcast relative to those comments.
So thank you, Stephen. Thank you all. As I said, I think this has been fantastic. What I find myself thinking about as I've been listening, and I tend to think of myself as being 3/4 full and Stephen being about a sip and a half from the top in terms of optimism, is that a lot of the papers that are being published now about the COVID relationship aren't NASH, they're fatty liver, they're NAFLD. In part because who my clients are, and in part because how these drugs are developed. And one of the questions I've kept asking myself since I've gotten involved with liver disease is what happens to drugs that are better for F1 and F2 than they are for F3? Because the economics of early stage fibrosis have not yet been clear. But if it turns out that fatty liver in and of itself, therefore early stage NASH even worse, will have an impact on susceptibility to pandemic, then all those products, those medications have a stronger rationale. Now, they're going to have to rethink how they do some of the things they do, and it may take them a few years to get there, the ones that are earlier to market. But it really opens up far more broadly the opportunity for the NASH category for lots of medications to serve lots of different purposes, and I think that's fantastically exciting, in part because it just hit me in the last 15 minutes. I want to thank everybody for a fantastic session. Peter, for some excellent preparation up front and giving us questions that we all had time to think through and a standard that the four of us now need to live up to. I want to thank Frank for being fantastic, as always, on the board. I want to thank Eric Rounds, our social media guru, who never makes it to these things, but has been exceptional in getting us awareness out in the world. And I want to thank everybody who's been listening. Tell your friends. We're having fun. You should have fun listening. We look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye now.
You've been listening to Surfing the NASH Tsunami. Send in your questions to surfingnash.com, and our panelists will spend the first 5 minutes of next week's episode answering your questions. Visit us online today, surfingnash.com.